The shadows of giants. In a deep valley, surrounded by impassable mountains, there was a laboratory hidden from prying eyes. It was created by the best scientists in the world under the aegis of governments aiming to create something greater than just another technological revolution. Their goal was grand: to create a giant human who could withstand the elements, work in the most extreme conditions, and protect humanity from any threats. The project was led by Dr. Edward Lance, a genius yet obsessed with the idea of surpassing nature. He believed that great discoveries always required sacrifices and urged his team not to stop, even when the first experiments failed. After many years of work, they succeeded in creating the first giants. They were 3 times the size of regular humans, with incredible strength and endurance. But most importantly, they were intelligent. The giants quickly absorbed knowledge and performed the most complex tasks. The laboratory celebrated their triumph, and Lance already saw himself in the pages of history. However, soon everything changed. One day, one of the laboratory workers disappeared. The security assumed he might have gotten lost in the mountains or fallen into one of the deep ravines surrounding the base. But after a few days, another one disappeared. Then 2 more. The cameras in the hallways recorded nothing suspicious, as if the people simply vanished into thin air. Dr. Lance, though concerned, reassured the team that it was just a coincidence. But one day, during another routine check, one of the guards found something that made everyone shudder. In the large storage room where the giants trained, he found remnants of a human form, bones gnawed to a shine. Lance ordered that this information be kept secret. "It's just an accident," he told the team, though deep down, he knew it was far from that. With each passing day, the giants became more aggressive. Their eyes, which once radiated calm and friendliness, now burned with a predatory gleam. One of the researchers, Dr. Rachel Morris, noticed a strange pattern. The giants who were fed regular food started losing mass and strength, while those suspected of involvement in the disappearances, on the other hand, became stronger and more active. When she conducted an analysis, she discovered the terrifying truth. The metabolism of the giants required human flesh. Their cells processed human flesh, creating a unique form of energy that allowed them to grow and maintain incredible endurance. Rachel shared her findings with Lance. But instead of stopping the experiment, he ordered silence. He feared losing funding and recognition. One evening, as darkness covered the valley, the giants broke free from their cages. They became hunters and humans, prey. The laboratory turned into an arena of chaos. A group of scientists led by Rachel tried to escape, but the path to the only exit was blocked. Those who managed to survive hid in corners and ventilation shafts, afraid to even breathe. The giants, it seemed, understood more than they should. They played with their victims, hunting them, studying their fears. The screams echoed through the dark corridors of the laboratory, and the giants, with a deep roar, chased those who were still alive. Rachel, along with a few colleagues, hid in a technical room where the backup generator and server base were located. Their only chance was to shut down the laboratory's power system to block the giants in certain areas and try to call for help. "They can feel us," whispered engineer Michael, looking at the surveillance monitors. "It's like they know where we are." "This isn't just instinct," Rachel replied, glancing at the screens. "We made them this way. Their intelligence developed faster than we anticipated. They are studying us, adapting." Suddenly, one of the monitors went dark. Then another. The cameras installed in the areas where the giants were began turning off one by one. "They're destroying the cameras," Rachel whispered, panic in her voice. "They know we're watching." Michael and another technician, Sarah, rushed to the generator. Rachel realized they needed to act quickly. She found an old map of the laboratory and saw that they could block the giants in the central complex by sealing several gates. "We have a chance," she said. "But we need to manually close the gates in Zone D13. D13? Michael went pale. "That's right next to the cages." "Otherwise, they'll break free," Rachel replied firmly. Zone D13. Michael and Sarah agreed to go with Rachel. Armed only with flashlights, a few tools, and portable soldering irons, they set off for Zone D13. The corridors were grim, with flickering lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Quiet," whispered Sarah when she heard a strange sound. It was as if something massive was moving behind the wall. "It's the ventilation," muttered Michael, trying to calm himself. But they all knew it was a lie. Suddenly, one of the giant creatures appeared from around the corner. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, and its mouth was stained with the blood of its latest victims. It slowly moved toward them, crouching as if inspecting who was in front of it. "Run!" Rachel screamed. They fled, but the giant was faster. Its massive hand swooped above their heads, narrowly missing Sarah. They managed to climb into a technical tunnel that was too narrow for the creature. The giant roared and began smashing the walls, trying to reach them. "We won't have time," Michael said, glancing at the map. "If we don't activate the lockdown now, they'll break through to the exit." Rachel knew Michael was right. When they reached Zone D13, Sarah began working on the gate lockdown, while Michael tried to hold the control panel despite constant system failures. Rachel noticed another giant was approaching them. "Go!" she shouted. "What are you doing?" Michael yelled. "This is our only chance. You have to finish the lockdown." Rachel ran to meet the giant, holding the portable soldering iron. She knew that her sacrifice would give the others a few extra minutes. The giant roared when she got close and lunged at her. At that moment, Sarah finished the lockdown procedure. The gates slammed shut, cutting the giants off from the rest of the laboratory. But Rachel was no longer among the living. Sarah and Michael returned to the server room. They managed to send an emergency signal beyond the laboratory. Soon, a government helicopter arrived to evacuate them from the horrific trap. However, the giants couldn't be destroyed. They remained locked in the central complex, but everyone understood it wouldn't last long. Their intelligence and adaptability meant that one day they would find a way to break free. Michael and Sarah were the only ones who knew the full truth about the experiment. They vowed to tell what happened and prevent such a mistake from happening again. But a few years later, people began disappearing in the mountains near the valley. Locals whispered about strange noises at night and mysterious shadows appearing on the slopes. The giants were still waiting. And they were hungry. After the evacuation, Michael and Sarah lived under constant government surveillance. They were forced to sign non-disclosure agreements and conceal all the details of the experiment. The government decided that instead of destroying the giants, they would use them for other projects, blaming the incident on a technical malfunction. Sarah couldn't come to terms with the fact that what they had created was still alive. She felt guilty for everything that had happened, and at night she was tormented by nightmares. Giant figures chased her, and their eyes glowed with hunger. Michael, though appearing calmer, was not indifferent. He kept an eye on the news and noticed troubling signs. Reports of missing tourists in the mountains, cases where locals found enormous tracks on the ground or heard strange noises at night. "It's only a matter of time," Michael said one evening, sitting with Sarah in her apartment. "They'll find a way to escape." "We have to do something," Sarah replied firmly. "If the government won't destroy them, we will." "It's suicide," Michael sighed, but he saw the same determined glint in her eyes that he had seen many times during their work at the laboratory. Sarah and Michael decided to act on their own. They used all their knowledge of the laboratory security system and gathered the necessary equipment to return to the valley. Their goal was clear: infiltrate the central complex and activate the self-destruct protocol that Lance had never dared to initiate. They reached the abandoned laboratory under the cover of night. The massive complex looked eerie: shattered equipment, damaged walls, and silence broken only by the wind blowing through the cracks. "They're still here," whispered Sarah as she saw deep tracks in the dust covering the floor. "And they're not sleeping," Michael added, noticing movement in the darkness. The giants were now even bigger. Their bodies were covered in scars, and their eyes glowed red, like fire. It seemed that years of isolation had made them even smarter and more dangerous. Sarah and Michael made their way to the central server room to activate the self-destruct system. They knew they didn't have much time. The giants had sensed their presence. When they reached the server room, Sarah began entering the activation codes, while Michael tried to keep the doors blocked. But one of the giants was already close. It struck the door with all its might, breaking the lock. "Hurry!" Michael yelled, trying to hold the metal bar that he had propped against the door. "Just a little longer," Sarah replied, entering the final code. The doors broke open, and the giant stormed into the room. Michael lunged at it with a homemade grenade he had prepared for the mission. He threw it straight at the creature's face, and the room was shaken by the explosion. "Michael!" Sarah screamed, but he was already lying under the rubble. "Finish it," he whispered, smiling at her for the last time. Sarah activated the system. The complex filled with the sound of alarms, and the automated voice announced, "Self-destruct activated. Evacuate within 5 minutes." She ran out of the room, trying to outrun the explosions that were beginning to spread through the corridors. The giants, enraged and frightened, charged toward her, but the fire consumed them. Sarah barely escaped the complex when a massive explosion destroyed everything inside. The ground trembled beneath her feet, and the laboratory vanished in a cloud of dust and flames. Sarah was the only one who survived. Local rescuers found her after hearing the explosion. She was exhausted but certain that she had finally stopped this horrific threat. However, a few months later, people began to disappear again in a neighboring town. One day, the forester reported something strange. He had found a massive footprint in the mountains that resembled a human's. Sarah learned about the discovered footprint through an old acquaintance, a journalist to whom she had once entrusted part of the truth about the experiment. Although he hadn't published her story, he was still monitoring the developments in the region. "Are you sure all the giants have been destroyed?" he asked when they met in a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city. Sarah remained silent. She wanted to believe that nothing could have survived after the explosion. But part of her subconscious whispered, "What if?" "It's just a coincidence," she finally replied. "Maybe some bear left the footprint." "Bears don't leave footprints like this," the journalist leaned in closer. "This is something else." Sarah couldn't ignore her doubts any longer. The next morning, she headed to the mountains. This time, she was better prepared. She brought a weapon, a thermal camera, and a tracker to identify footprints. When she reached the spot where the forester had found the footprint, she was overcome with an eerie feeling. The giant footprint indeed resembled a human's, but it was even larger than the one she had seen before. "How is this possible?" she whispered, surveying the area. Suddenly, she heard movement. Something large and heavy was approaching through the forest. Sarah froze, hiding behind a rock, and turned on the thermal camera. On the screen, she saw a massive figure moving between the trees. It was a giant. But it was different. Its body was covered in horrific burns, and some of its limbs looked distorted. It was the one that had survived the explosion. Sarah watched the giant, trying to figure out where it was headed. She saw it inspecting the forest as though looking for something. Then she heard a scream. The giant had found a group of tourists who were starting a fire nearby. "No," Sarah whispered, drawing her weapon. She ran toward the scene, but it was too late. The giant charged at the people with incredible speed. The tourists' screams quickly faded. Sarah raised her rifle and aimed, but her hands were trembling. Memories of how the giants had torn apart her colleagues in the lab returned with new intensity. "You have to do this," she told herself, forcing her finger to pull the trigger. The shot hit the giant in the shoulder, but it only enraged him. He turned toward her, roaring so loudly that the ground shook. Sarah ran as fast as she could, trying to break free from the giant. She used narrow paths and ravines to make it harder for him to follow. Her tracker showed that another creature was getting closer. "Another one?" She stopped, panting. A second massive figure appeared around the bend, smaller than the first but faster. Sarah understood. The giants hadn't just survived, they had started to reproduce. She saw an abandoned mountain hut and rushed toward it. She locked the door behind her, found an old radio, and tried to send out a distress signal. "Can anyone hear me? This is Sarah Morris. The giants survived, and they're hunting again. We need help." The radio hissed, and Sarah heard a voice. "We hear you. Hold on, reinforcements are on the way." Sarah stayed in the hut until dawn. The sounds of explosions and helicopter rotors announced the arrival of government forces. They began firing at the giants, but they proved to be incredibly resilient. Sarah watched as the creatures fled toward the mountains, using caves and hideouts to evade the attack. "They won't stop," she told the military commander who found her. "You must destroy them before they adapt." "We'll do everything we can," the commander replied, but Sarah saw doubt in his eyes. She understood. If the giants found a way to survive and reproduce, it would mean the end of humanity. High in the mountains, one of the giants, wounded but alive, watched as people left the valley. He tilted his head back and let out a roar that echoed throughout the area. It was not just a cry of pain. It was a warning. The government forces left the area after a 3-day raid, claiming that all the giants had been destroyed. But Sarah knew that wasn't true. She had seen their cunning, their ability to adapt and survive. And she was certain that the ones who had survived would now learn to act more cautiously. Sarah decided to stay in the region to observe the situation. She settled in a remote house near the mountains, working with the locals and gathering information about the strange occurrences. A few months later, rumors about missing tourists began to surface again. Foresters found destroyed camps, leftover food, and clothing. But no human bodies. "They're hunting again," Sarah said to herself, examining one of the sites. Sarah realized that the giants might be hiding in the caves. She consulted geological maps of the region and discovered that the cave network under the mountains was much more complex than previously thought. These caves could serve as an ideal hideout for creatures of such size. Recruiting a few brave locals, she organized an expedition to one of the largest caves. The team consisted of several armed volunteers, a scientist, and a drone operator. "If the giants are there, we'll find them," one of the volunteers said, checking the gear. They entered the cave, lighting the dark passages with powerful flashlights. Stalactites hung from the ceiling, and the walls were covered in damp moss. But the most disturbing thing was the smell, a metallic rotten stench of blood. "Something's not right," Sarah whispered. Suddenly, the drone operator stopped. On the monitor, he saw something huge moving in the distance. "It's them," he said. The group cautiously moved forward. In a vast cave chamber, they encountered a true horror. Piles of bones, not only from animals but also from humans. In the center of the chamber stood 2 giants. One of them was the same one that had survived the explosion. Its body was covered in scars, but it looked stronger than ever. The second giant was younger, but no less dangerous. Its movements were smooth and cautious, as if it were studying the humans. "They're raising a new generation," Sarah whispered. The giants noticed the group and began moving toward them. "Run!" Sarah shouted. The volunteers opened fire, but the bullets only irritated the creatures. One of the giants grabbed a man like a toy and threw him against the wall. Sarah and a few others managed to flee deeper into the cave. They found a narrow passage that the giants couldn't squeeze through. "We need to get out of here and tell people," Sarah said, wiping blood from a cut on her forehead. "They'll chase us," one of the volunteers replied. "We're their next victims." Sarah realized she couldn't handle this threat alone anymore. She decided to turn to independent hunters and scientists who could help study the giants and find a way to destroy them once and for all. She formed a team of people who had lost loved ones to the giants and those who wanted to understand how these creatures had evolved so quickly. Their new plan was to lure the giants to the surface and use their strength against them. Sarah's team planned a large-scale operation. They used sound traps to lure the giants out of the caves. Once outside, they intended to activate explosives that would collapse the mountain passages, cutting off the giants' hideouts. When the giants emerged, the battle was fierce. The humans suffered heavy losses, but eventually, the operation succeeded. The mountains trembled with explosions, and the caves collapsed, burying all the creatures. Sarah stood on top of a hill, watching the dust settle over the destroyed remains of the giants. "Now it's over," she whispered. But somewhere in the world, there remained a possibility that someone would want to repeat the experiment. And Sarah knew the story of the giants could happen again. A year after the final battle, Sarah returned to the city, leaving the mountains behind. She no longer worked in laboratories or expeditions. Her days were quiet, working in a small bookstore, walking in the park, and chatting with a few close friends. But inside, she never felt free. One evening, returning home, she saw a stranger waiting for her at the door. The man looked official, a strict suit, dark glasses, and a briefcase in his hand. "MS. Morris?" he asked in a cold voice. "That depends on who's asking," she replied, eyeing him warily. "I represent a new research organization studying anomalies. We know about your achievements and your unique expertise. We have a few questions for you." "I don't deal with science anymore," Sarah replied firmly. "This isn't an offer," the stranger said, handing her an envelope. "You have answers we need. And I think you'll be interested to see what we found." He left, leaving her holding the envelope. Sarah hesitantly opened it. Inside were photographs, footprints resembling those she had seen in the mountains, and blurry images of a creature that seemed even larger than the giant she had encountered before. On the back of one of the photos, there was a note. "This is just the beginning." Sarah crumpled the photo, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a cold fear. She realized that her battle with the monsters had only been the first chapter of a much larger story.